Dr. Rangarajan, Professor Mahendra Dev, Professor Subbarao, Dr. Pandit, and everyone present here, including the young graduates. First of all, on behalf of all of us present here, on behalf of the IGIDR, I want to thank Dr. Rangarajan for that very erudite and comprehensive talk on the current issues in central banking. It was truly an intellectual tour de force of the current issues. Most of you would not have known, but in 1991, when you were very young, probably in school, we had a big balance of payments crisis. And that set off economic reforms that you must have read about in your textbooks. Dr. Rangarajan was then the deputy governor and later on went on to become governor, and he was the intellectual force behind a number of economic reforms that you today take for granted, including the exchange rate reforms that we had undertaken that year, that referred to in his address. Second, I want to congratulate the young graduates for their degrees. You're going out into the world today with degrees in your hand and a lot of education behind you. Whenever I come to a convocation, my thoughts go back to my own convocation, which was sometime in the dark ages. So if you actually draw a timeline, time T0, which was discovery of fire, and time today, which is the invention of the iPad, my degree was somewhere in between there. When I got a degree, our telephones used to have cords. Our cameras had films. And we used to do calculations using something called a slide rule. I don't know if you've heard of that, slide rule. Your fathers might have some antique slide rules. And when we referred to a mouse, it was something that we saw in the kitchen and got scared. That was our concept of a mouse. So that was a time when I got my degree, but you were getting a degree at a time when the world has changed a lot since the time I got my degree. India has changed a lot. Economics has changed a lot. And you're going out into a very exciting India, very exciting world, and I wish you all the very best. And you're also getting your degrees during the Silver Jubilee year of the IGIDR, which is again a milestone event in your lives. And I'm sure that you will remember this day for all your career and for all your lives. I also want to point out that Professor Mahendra Dev slightly underestimated the proportion of girls. I had calculated doing that, including the MPhil and PhD students, and the proportion of girls is even higher than 60% that he had mentioned. So I want to congratulate all of you. I want to comment only briefly on Dr. Rangarajan's address because it was so comprehensive that it's difficult to add anything further to that. Again, as Professor Mahendra Dev said, we had a conference in the Reserve Bank last week when the main theme of the conference was indeed this, the challenges facing the central bank. Dr. Rangarajan, you will recall, referred to the price stability objective of the central banks, how to harmonize that price stability objective with the growth objective, and then also this evolving new objective post-crisis of financial stability, and the challenge for central banks of managing this tension between price stability, growth, and financial stability. That was big enough, challenging enough, but then has become even more challenging over the last 1.5 years because of the European crisis, the sovereign debt crisis. Now the ECB is being told that you must bend and stretch your mandate, not only to look after price stability, not only to look after financial stability, but also that the central bank, the ECB, must be mindful of sovereign debt concerns. In fact, the ECB is being asked, why are you being so Brahminical about your mandate when the world around you is collapsing? You have to be mindful of sovereign debt sustainability because if there is no Europe, there is no ECB. So your basic responsibility is to prop up Europe. So the challenge is not only price stability, growth, and financial stability, but it's price stability, growth, financial stability, and sovereign debt sustainability. But sovereign debt sustainability is not like price stability. It's quintessentially a political issue. How much debt governments raise, how they raise that debt is a political issue. And once central banks start getting into that area, start becoming mindful of that, there is a risk that not only you might fail, but that you might be crossing that line between a political central bank and a political function of raising debt. So I would urge you to read Dr. Rangarajan's speech once again after you've celebrated your degrees and understand it very well, because I'll give you a right appreciation of the challenges that central banks are facing, which is important no matter what job you're going to take on. But I can't resist the temptation of giving some advice to young graduates whenever I see them, so I'll give you some advice. You know, economics, as economists, you're more influential than you think you are. Okay, I quote from Keynes, you must have seen this. Keynes said, "The ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they're right and when they're wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist." That is Keynes saying, talking about economists. And you know, Professor Paul Samuelson, who wrote that seminal textbook, many of you studied that, he said, "I don't care who writes a nation's laws, as long as I'm able to write its economics textbooks." Okay? So that's how influential economists are. But economics as a body of knowledge and economists as shapers of public policy, those roles are changing. Indeed, economists have come up for a lot of criticism during the crisis, as all of you know. I said this at the previous two convocations, but I want to say this again, which is that when the Queen went to the London School of Economics sometime in early 2009, like we came into IGIDR now, and then she was being introduced to all the faculty members, big economists. And then she shook hands with all of them, and she asked them, "How come none of you saw the crisis coming?" Challenged the economists. So the crisis came as a big blow to economists. It dented their reputation, it dented their credibility, and it shattered their confidence. But you must understand that what happened to economists after the crisis with reference to what was happening to them before the crisis. Before the crisis, economists were like rock stars. They could prophesy, they could pronounce on anything. They produced a great moderation, which is a period of steady growth with extraordinary price stability. So economists thought that they'd solved the world's problems. They were looking for new problems to solve. Then you had the Black-Scholes model, which could calculate risk to the 17th decimal place. And economists thought they had finished all the questions that we normally have to address every day. Therefore, they went on to invent new questions that we don't think of and started answering them. Like, for example, if you read this tipping point, the Freakonomics, what are the questions that economists were asking? Well, why do drug dealers continue to live with their mothers? Okay? What is common between school teachers and sumo wrestlers? And they not only thought of these questions, but answered them with great aplomb. And everybody celebrated the success of economics, and suddenly the crisis came and crashed everything. Okay. So I think it's time for economists to ask some soul-searching questions and identify your role in academics, your role in society, your role in your communities. A few things I want to say. Professor Mahendra Dev said that economics is not like physics. One thing that happened before the crisis was that economists thought that a good way of giving distinction to their profession is to model it like physics. So, quantitative science, physics has that exactitude about everything. So they started looking for parallels between physics and economics. If you look very deeply, you would indeed find some parallels like, if you look at the theory of rational expectations, which says that wages and prices adjust instantaneously to new conditions because of perfect information. That's the theory of rational expectations. You have similar theories in physics, like the Newton's law, which says that gravitational configuration of the universe adjusts instantaneously. If I just move this thing from here to here, the entire gravitational configuration of the universe adjusts instantaneously. So there are parallels like that. Similarly, there is this, Keynes talked about some inescapable uncertainty in estimating risk, which is like the uncertainty principle of economics. You have the very celebrated uncertainty principle in physics, right? Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. So there are parallels between physics and economics, but those parallels are only incidental parallels. That does not mean that economics is like physics in any sense. Laws of physics are absolute, immutable. The mass of an electron does not change. Whether I measure it here, I measure it in Kolkata, I measure it in New York. But the laws of economics change. Okay? There is the mass, the price of a derivative, for example, is not absolute. It depends on a number of factors. Laws of physics. If you say energy lost is equal to energy gained, that is an absolute law, second law of thermodynamics, right? I mean, the entire universe is built on that principle, on that law. But you take the laws of economics, there is nothing immutable about supply being equal to demand, or about savings being equal to investment. Those are not immutable laws. So, remember that economics, you're dealing with people, you're dealing with behavior, you're dealing with society, you're dealing with sociology. So, in as much as you deal with human systems, you have to be conscious of the human dimension of your profession. The second thing I want to say is about the models that you build. Economics is based on building models. But what happened over the last 3-4 decades is that because model building is so fundamental to advancing economics knowledge, economists modeled what they can rather than what they should. They studied what can be modeled rather than deciding what should be studied and modeling that. Take, for example, this dynamic stochastic general equilibrium. I don't even know what that means, DSG models. The criticism, so you may have studied that DSG model, the criticism of that model is that it takes into account only the real sectors of the economy. It doesn't take into account the financial sectors. Maybe some of you will do PhDs on that. I know that there is some work going on extending the DSG models to encompass the financial sector, but you got to be conscious of the limitations of your model. Or take the Black-Scholes. Black-Scholes option pricing is based on assuming normal distribution of risk. But then they ignored the fat tails, and that's how Black-Scholes came for disrepute and eventually for a lot of misery to a lot of people. In economic models, we also believe that there is some rational individual there, rational human being, who knows everything, who is behaving rationally, who is making rational decisions based on perfect information, and that the macroeconomic world is an aggregation of these microeconomic entities. But we forget that when these microeconomic entities aggregate to a macroeconomic entity, they interact with each other, and that changes the macroeconomic system. So remember that when you build models, you have to be conscious of the limitations of models, and you have to model what you have to study rather than study what you can model. The third, I'm going to tell you four things. The third thing I'm going to say is that you have to apply judgment. You remember Dr. Rangarajan spoke about capital account management. You study that in your textbooks, it's all there, what happens when you do something. But the important thing is to make a judgment on what should be done. And real world doesn't behave like a textbook. As I said earlier, if you intervene in the market, it's not just a question of moving the rupee this way or that way. You're also playing a game with other market participants. There is that behavior involved. And you have to factor how other people, the market is going to respond to your action and build that into your judgment, into your policy decision. So making judgments is a very important part of practicing economics. Even a few months ago, the economists did a study of countries which are overheating, I think 3-4 months ago. And they ranked India as the second most overheating economy in the world. And that was simply incredulous, that we were an overheating economy and the second most overheating economy. They did that based on some indicators. Of course, they gave all those indicators, but those indicators were applied completely inappropriately to studying India. For example, the GDP growth rate over 10 years, not recognizing that a structurally transforming economy would grow very fast, not recognizing that credit GDP would go up very fast in an economy like ours. So if you apply just a mathematical formula across the country, independent of the situation of the country, then you get into problems and get into wrong inferences. So remember that when you have to apply economics, as much as you apply a textbook knowledge, you also need to apply judgment. The last thing I want to say is that if you're going to practice economics, you must have a sense of history, sense of economic history. Economics is not locked into straitjacketed time. It's not what happens today, but what happens today, what will happen tomorrow will depend on what happened over several centuries in the economic world. There is this book by Reinhardt and Rogoff. You may have come across that. They said this time is different, 800 years of crisis. What they're trying to show in that book is that if you study economic crisis over 800 years, the fundamental causes of all those crises are the same. But every time a crisis happens, and economists such as yourselves are questioned, you say, no, this time was different. Last time a crisis happened, that we fixed all that, but something new happened, and therefore this crisis happened. But what Reinhardt and Rogoff show is that we've not learned from history, we've not learned from our past experience. Every crisis is fundamentally because of the same causes. So if you've got to be an effective, intelligent, useful, relevant economist, you have to have a sense of history. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I wish you all the very best. Once again, I want to thank Dr. Rangarajan for his address. Thank you.